Hey, and welcome to another episode of the BlueScreen Brothers directly from Redmond, just outside of Seattle. I'm currently sitting in Building 88 of Microsoft together with my co-MVP Rob Quickenden and Surface Program Manager Frank Buchholz. Welcome.
Hi, it's great to be here again.
Hey, and we've met before for a different episode, Frank, but for new listeners, who are you and what do you do?
Yeah, so hey, I'm Frank Buchholz. I work on the Surface commercial marketing team. I head up technical marketing for Surface. We really focus in on storytelling to our IT pro audiences. So we really focus in on how Surface is the best device in the space of deployment, management, and security. And, those are kind of our really big things that we try to focus on and, essentially work across all of Microsoft to kind of build this best together story.
Then my brother from the Great Britain's United Kingdom. Rob, who are you and what do you do?
Hi, so yeah, two roles, I guess. So work mode, I'm the Chief Technology Officer for a Microsoft and Cisco partner called Cecilian. So my role really is to do client advisory and technical strategy for our customers across commercial, public sector, healthcare. And yeah, quite rightly, I'm your brother as an MVP in the UK. So yeah, good. Thanks for having me on the show.
So today, I would really like to kind of scratch the top of mind of both of you when it comes to security from chip to cloud. A lot of companies are really focusing on identity security. They're worrying about malicious software in their browser. They're all on the high level, everything that's out there. But you really got to pay attention on what's happened on the silicon. And Frank, I know no one better to tell a story than you.
I think the thing that I always like to kind of draw back on is that, security is never taken for granted and that security has to be implemented literally at every level. I mean, it's kind of almost like one of the design principles of the product. And so when we design these products, not only are we thinking about how to secure them, but also how do we manufacture them, right? So, you look at the different places that, these days in the geopolitical spectrum of, manufacturing and, the ever shifting, having to manufacture in one country compared to another. But how do you keep these same lines of essentially consistency and security? And I would say one of the things that I'm always proud about is the fact that Surface is a first-party product from Microsoft, which means that not only can we control, essentially what goes into the manufacturing of the product, but we can also control what it is, the firmware that goes into that product as well. I mean, certainly silicon vendors and people that make motherboards or chips or other pieces, we work with them closely, but in the end, their products don't do anything without that firmware and that microcode that really sits on there. And I always like to point out to people there's a difference between the firmware and the microcode compared to the operating system that runs on the device. In fact, on a Surface device, you have to think that there's many different layers of software that you have to start considering, whether it's the firmware that actually makes that chip work, whether it's like when you turn it on, how does that processor know what to do? How does that USB port know what to do? How does that graphic chipset know what to do?
Is it enabled? Like the way you can configure that in DFCI?
Right.
So even just by software, killing the power to that USB.
Yeah, so that's one of the unique things about a Surface device is early on we were like saying, hey, we started using essentially a UEFI or a BIOS much like every other OEM from what was called American Megatrend. And so this AMI BIOS and what later became known as a UEFI, this is something that we would get off the shelf from another company. And Microsoft was like, well, we're a software vendor. Like, we're a software company. We pride ourselves in the software we make. We can make a UEFI as well. So we actually made an open source UEFI, and we actually shared that code with other brethren out there from Intel to others. But right now, Surface and maybe a few others, I think Asus and Panasonic, use this UEFI. And it's called Project MU, MU. And you can go out and look it up, and it's essentially out on GitHub and others. You can actually download the source code, so it's super transparent towards how it works. But the UEFI actually controls the firmware that's on the device. This is before the operating system even comes into play. And so when we start talking about things from chip to cloud, we're talking about literally manufacturing something, ensuring that the firmware that you put on that circuitry is safe and secure. And then how do you essentially move into the operating system and install the operating system on the device in a safe and secure manner, which is all from Microsoft. And then you essentially think about how do you update these devices? And you think about, hey, the update process needs to work not only for the operating system, but it needs to be able to update, say, the UEFI and the firmware on the device as well. And I always like to go back just to paint a picture. There was, many years ago, there was this problem of Spectre and Meltdown. pretty famous, vulnerability. But it shows kind of the value of Surface and the value of using a single updater in order to update the device. And so Spectre Meltdown was essentially a vulnerability that was found on every chipset that a Google engineer actually found. And it was on every Intel, every AMD, even every NVIDIA processor that was out there, because they all had a similar architecture and they all had the same flaw. But it was in the microcode, right? It wasn't in the operating system. It wasn't actually anywhere else but in the microcode of that chip. And so how do you actually update the microcode? Well, Surface is in the unique position, because we have our own UEFI, that we can update through Windows Update not only the operating system, but we can actually change the microcode on the actual chip in order to update it. And so if you ever have a Surface device and you ever see it going through an update, you might see colored bars shooting across the screen.
And there's a lot of color bars.
Each color represents a different piece of firmware or a different subsystem on the device that it's updating the firmware on. Firmware is an important thing, because in the security world, people are deciding like operating systems are fairly well protected, but the firmware isn't protected. And so, and also the unique thing about a firmware is if you were able to hack the firmware, you can make changes before the operating system even boots. The operating system doesn't check on the firmware, but in a Surface device, you're constantly updating the firmware. And the other thing is that Surface devices use a unique capability within our TPM, or Trusted Platform Module, where we store the security keys that kind of say like what the checksum is of that firmware. Meaning like when you boot the device, is the checksum inside the TPM, this kind of vault of secret information or kind of trusted information, doesn't match, so that when you boot the device, it goes through this secure boot in order to ensure that everything that it's booting is checking out clearly. And if
no one has been in there manipulating the firmware.
And if it's not, then the
off.
device just halts. It just stops.
And if I'm not mistaken, one of the first time that was used was in the Xbox 360, where it booted up a virtual machine and kind of checked all the firmware so that no one would tamper with the Xbox.
That's right.
So we've seen that it's been taking from a kind of there's only one thing that matters for a gaming industry, and that is don't be hacked.
Right. Well, on a device like Xbox, where there's like millions upon millions of them, could you imagine being able to hack that, and you'd hack into everybody's living room kind of
Well,
thing?
it's also, of course, a massive revenue stream, right, as well. So I think initially it was also about trying to protect gaming revenue, right, from hacks and things.
So that, again, going back to the unique thing on Surface, though, is through that Windows Update, and going back to even Spectre Meltdown, we were able to change the microcode on that Intel processor, and we did it the day and date that essentially the vulnerability was announced. So we pushed automatically through Windows Update the idea that your device needs to be always up to date. And this is honestly, I think this is more like Rob, because Rob's actually out dealing with customers day in and day out, as you are as well, Alexander. And I have to think that seems like it's a pill to swallow for our customers to say, how do I keep my device always up to date? But the trade-off is that you have a secured device that literally is always up to date. And on a Surface device, it's unique enough to say that it's always up to date all the way down to the firmware level. So
yeah, and I think if I think about the journey of Surface from the very beginning, it's all about sometimes innovating the market and helping organizations understand something they didn't even know was a problem before. And that stands for innovation. So we think about, and Alex, you touched earlier on about some of the early Surface innovation, but I think about things like Windows Hello as a security mechanism, which didn't exist before Surface, right? That was something that Surface brought to market. And now we kind of take that for granted, and that's obviously evolved from facial recognition to fingerprint, and et cetera, et cetera. And if we now think about, Frank, what you were saying about the whole secure ecosystem from chip to cloud, initially before Microsoft sort of stepped in and kind of again demonstrated what good should look like and what premium should look like, that was a problem that many organizations didn't realize was a problem because there was nothing you could do about it, right? So to your point about vulnerabilities, then yes, IT, Secure Ops kept the OS up to date, hopefully. They kept things patched, hopefully. And then at some point down the line, they might get an updated tool from their vendor OEM, and they might have that clunky mechanism, which it was.
Please download that tooling to
absolutely.
update it.
I mean, how do you get that? And it was easier. I mean, we had COVID in the middle, so how do you do that, right? And particularly where you had this situation where users were just being sent devices and they probably never got touched by IT, and the update process was probably behind a VPN, so even the OSs weren't being patched. So I think actually, if you think about that from an importance level now, that's so much simpler from, from a security perspective of giving assurance to the organisation that you're protected, but secondly from an IT administration perspective and just a cost and effort perspective. It's if you live in a Surface world, you don't think about it because that's just what happens.
Right.
And there's really a change of mindset because we've moved away from the traditional IT gets a laptop, IT unboxes the brown box, IT plugs it in, IT hits F12, then it's safe. So now it's more like, how can we buy a product that we don't have to deal with that and ship it directly to the end users? And we know that. That's what happens with, I remember when IT had to open my new Samsung phone, plug it in and hit F12. No, wait, that never happened. So why do we do that with PCs?
Right.
So now we see that we have to trust in other tooling than System Center Config Manager for continuously updating. And we see Windows Update does some of that action. But what do you see that commercial customers ask for, Rob?
So I think there is definitely still a legacy of that's the way we've always done things. So I still see organisations, and I kind of chuckle to myself sometimes when I see it, but it's history. It's what they've always done of that exact point you talk about. Hitting F12, imaging a device, quite often putting an older version of an OS, an older version of applications, an older patch level on the devices, and then having their own patch mechanism. Where I see organisations evolving and doing this well, and I think actually I've seen that particularly in the last 6 months, the drive to Windows 11, obviously with Windows 10 going end of life later this year, it's given organisations an opportunity to take a step back and look at their approach. And we as a Surface reseller, we sell and ship a lot of devices direct to end customers. So we have customers that are global, that literally send a device to the end user. The end user switches that device on. They use autopilot to automatically configure that device. It's secured at the point they purchase it, with the serial number being locked to that tenant, so it can't, even if it gets intercepted in transit, it can't be used by anybody else. And at that point, the device is built, it's provisioned to the right level, and then we're seeing a huge push now with newer services in Windows like AutoPatch, where they're actually taking that trust level a step further to Microsoft and trusting Microsoft to do the OS patching, obviously with rings and those kind of things as well. So I think then when you think about devices that may go wrong or may get refreshed, or when people joiners and leavers and those kind of things, that whole process end to end becomes so much more seamless with that assurance of security as well.
Yeah. But I think what's interesting about Surface is early on, we saw that if we're going to do these zero-touch deployments, we need to be able to offer the same level, if not better levels of security and implementation services as we had with tools like SCCM or putting a gold image on the device. And one of the unique capabilities that we talked about with Surface is this ability to kind of tool the firmware on the device. And you mentioned this idea that, hey, what if I wanted to turn off this particular subsystem on the device? Like maybe I'm going to put this device into a kiosk area and it's going to be used as a point of sale device. I probably don't want to have Bluetooth on the device. I don't want people to hack into it. I want to be able to maybe turn off the USB ports on the device as well. And maybe I want to stop the ability to re-image the device, from a USB. So all of these capabilities are something that can come around with our UFI. Sorry, getting over a cold.
No, we're good.
I'll come back. Okay. So all of these capabilities are something that we can do with our UFI, and our UFI or our UEFI gives us granular level device access, so I could turn off USB ports. I could turn off the ability to boot from USB, meaning that I can't stick a thumb drive into it to re-image it. Only the organization that owns it could re-image it. And even if I was to re-image it, I can lock down those UFI settings so that only, that you need to essentially have a password, or you have to be essentially a network admin in order to
Intune admin.
Yeah, an Intune admin in order to reset it. What that does is it reduces the attack surface on the device. Essentially, it says, hey, this device is going to be at its minimal configuration in order for me to use it. We've had customers in the past that literally drilled out cameras in order to turn off the cameras on their devices, and we'd be like, you don't have to do that. You can just go into the UFI, turn off the subsystem for camera, and then it stops supplying electricity to that particular camera. And when you boot the operating system into Windows and go under Device Manager, you won't even see that there's a camera on the device. It says there's no camera existing on this device. What's cool though, and getting back to what Rob was describing with zero touch, is you can now do all of this on a Surface device through essentially this functionality we call DFCI, or Device Firmware Configuration Interface. Trust me, that is not a marketing term. It's very much an engineering term, but it's part of Intune. It's literally part of Intune. The Surface team worked with Intune to write a special, essentially, functionality just for the UFI that Surface devices run, and now Panasonic and Asus, I think, run as well. But we see this capability that we can actually tune this device so that by the time it boots up for the very first time and the user logs into it at the desktop, the device is locked down to the tenant that owns it. If it's minimalized to the essentially the surface, of what, from a security standpoint, that people could access. And now all of those same capabilities that you would have had from gold imaging or, custom configuration, somebody could actually set this up in their living room after unboxing it for the first time, and through that zero touch and that specific configuration that takes place through Autopilot and then Intune management, now essentially all those capabilities are there, but it's not almost seamless, and the IT admin has all the same access that they ever had onto that device, but the user just doesn't feel it. It feels kind of seamless to them. It feels like they're just buying a personal device and they're setting it up, even though the device is completely managed and now locked down to the tenant that the device is deployed onto.
I think it's a really good point, though, Alex, because I think that does make the end user feel a bit more like they're in control, because they're the ones clicking next and putting in the keyboard setting, all the things that they do need to customize to make the device feel like it's theirs, rather than a device that has been, sometimes poorly built and, an image that's not compatible with everything perhaps, or it's a bit out of date, and the user feeling it's a bit, rigid, to better word. And I don't have to be
on a corporate network. I don't have to be in a, I don't have to re-image or hold down the
perception of being in control.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's what it's about. And I think it's that complete, it is like that Apple experience, right? Of that, it's a premium quality device. They're getting the out-of-box experience themselves, so they're taking it out the box. They're taking the cover off it.
It's like their birthday.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that has a massive impact on that personal connection that we have to a device that, even as an employee, you're probably going to use for 3 to 4 years, and people do feel that personal connection.
There's a lot of studies done to this, and way back in the 60s, this guy called Joseph Weissenbaum, who created some of the first computer programs ever out there, he said that people connect emotional connections to both devices and software.
And cars, definitely cars.
And he compared that in the same way as musicians do to their instruments, and to drivers to their cars. So there are some truth that when you get to unbox, if it is a Surface, an Apple device, a Sonos speaker, it doesn't matter what it is. You get that attachment, and you could compare to whatever you want to compare, but that's why always mom and dad is there by birth. So you want that connection by having that first experience. And it sounds silly to compare a thingy to birth, but it's almost the same process happening. So how do you see that your customers prefer to receive and do that minor hassle thing? Because it is considered hassle. Why do I need to take position in tracking, telemetry, and all that? Why do I need to deal with that? Do they prefer it?
So I think it, again, it's back to my point. I think it's about feeling connected to the device, feeling ownership for how they look after the device, the experience of it, and therefore things like, ensuring it's up to date and those things, they actually care about those things. It's like your phone, right? If you get an update for your phone, you don't ignore it. Typically, you allow the update to happen. And I think traditionally, updates have been really important for IT, but a right pain in the backside for the user, right? Because there's updates and things. And if we think about the update process for most things now, I mean, when was the last time you got your phone out and there wasn't 27 app updates? I mean, 27 is probably a low number. So I think now that, users expect devices to be up to date and secure as well, because I think the security message is kind of hitting home. We see the impact of these attacks and these vulnerabilities. And therefore, it's really important that, as an IT organization, you protect your users' data, your corporate data, and users have a part to play in that. And I think the more we can do to automate and make that process just seamless in the background, then it does almost become transparent, and it really should be. It should be when we think about we were talking before it went live about supply chain, and I think that's a really important factor as well, about actually knowing where, sustainable computing, a bit like sustainable food. A lot of people care about where their food has come from. Well, actually, why wouldn't you care about where your technology comes from?
That's a very good analogy.
It been sourced?
Yeah. And to that, it's also about the toolings. We've seen that, of course, you can update the BIOS on other devices, but you probably need to download one or two different toolings.
Right.
And we need to find a way to kind of herd them into an update system, because you're not managing them, you're herding them. And one of the things that I also like about this chip to cloud security, chip to cloud journey, is that you have the different surface tooling, the surface integration in Intune, where you can also see the warranty status, because Microsoft provides 6 years of support for their devices. So not only do you have a simple tool to update them, which is Windows Update and Auto Patch, you also are guaranteed that you are getting security updates for 6 years. And you have a tool to see how long they're still within compliance. So I think that's a really good take, that you get a management portal to see, when am I supposed to replace these devices?
Well, and it's all in the same spot that your Intune manages in as well. Like, you're not having to manage multiple management tools, right? So if you're with, that's what I always pitch to people, is like the simplicity of Microsoft 365 is that you pay for a single license that not only gives you all of your productivity tools, you're also getting all of your management and security and deployment tools with that as well. And so within that single view, you're able to not only understand the app packages and other things that you're pushing through Intune down onto your device, but you're also able to open service tickets, or see bulletins, or see the inventory of your devices and understand when the warranty is going to expire. All of this is available through the Surface Management Portal, which is built into Intune. So again, it's kind of like that single source or single vendor approach, but there's a value there of being able to have everything integrated all into one. And whether we're inspecting and kind of going through the firmware of every single device that we go through, all the way up to the cloud-based management tools that we're referring to, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about chip to cloud.
I think when you touch on that as well, from a role perspective as well. So when we talk to organizations about why Surface, a lot of that is that simplicity, but it's also that life cycle of cradle to grave. So we touched earlier about the deployment perspective. So you procure, you ship, and the devices auto build. But also from a warranty perspective, because the experiences are connected and the management consoles are connected as well. If you get it to a situation where there is a fault and a user logs a fault, and the IT support get involved, actually knowing the state of that device, is there a firmware update that's pending, is there a Windows update that's pending, and then to be able to track that entire support ticket and management all the way through the process is really important. And you think, like, well, how did we do that before? Well, there were just different tools to do those things, and they weren't connected. Whereas now it's all just simply about having different access roles within the Intune platform to do those different tasks, but through a connected experience.
Well, and I'll even get a little provocative here of saying that, when you look at a Surface device inside of Microsoft, we only run one security agent, and that's Microsoft 365 Defender, right? Yeah. So we do not load it up with other security agents. And I would always challenge people that would say, like, if you don't think Microsoft is one of the most attacked, IT companies in the world, from a perspective, and that this is a company that relies on its own technology to secure our own critical information. Honestly, the way that the enterprise across the world operates and depends on tools like Azure and Windows, and we're relying on Windows Defender to protect our devices, we would say to our customers, there's no reason that you can't do the same. Now, certainly if you're looking at other OEMs out there, that might not, you might not always have this full picture of how to protect a device, so they'll go outside of Defender in order to do that. But I will challenge customers that nobody but Microsoft understands the threats and vulnerabilities of the Windows operating system and a Surface device. And we essentially call every problem a Surface problem. And so for us to be able to protect through a closed loop corrective action process, to be able to identify, isolate, and then update every single problem that we see as fast as we possibly can, we're not relying on other security agents, we're not relying on other databases, we're not relying on others in order to provide us. It is all within Microsoft in order to provide them. So if security is something that matters, and you're also worried about performance, because let's face it, more security agents you put on a device, the slower that device gets, then trust us, if you're going with one license from M365 and Windows Defender in order to protect your device, and a company like Microsoft relies on that ourselves, I think that's a good statement.
And you've done one minor thing. I see we're kind of running out of time.
Yeah.
But you've done one more thing to kind of offload the CPU and improve performance. And you're also updating quite another chip with another firmware, and that's the Microsoft Pluton.
Yeah, we should probably say that's a teaser. We would say that, like, what in that television show, there'd be like a sudden, like, hey, but yeah, come back next week and listen again. Because as we evolve silicon technology to system on chip, where that single piece of silicon with billions of transistors inside of it isn't just no longer your processor, it's now your GPU and your NPU and your system memory, but it's also this important thing called a TPM integrated into that silicon. And I think, we should come back later and do a little bit of a deep dive on what Pluton actually is.
Let's do a deep dive on Pluton.
Definitely.
Let's do it.
Thanks, Frank, and thanks, Rob.
Hey,
Thanks very
pleasure
much.
to be
Enjoyed
here.
that.
All right, thanks. Bye.